Good morning. This is Jason Dean coming live at you again for another Film Fanatic show. Hope everyone's doing good. It is 9:10 on a Saturday morning. The weather's been pretty sweet lately. We uh, we did manage to get a little bit of rain. I was headed up to a show yesterday afternoon and in the morning, and ended up being a overall really beautiful day. And it's a pretty nice morning right now. But on the way to the gig, it I got to this one area where I could just see these dark rain clouds, and it just poured for about 5 to 10 minutes, like downpour, and then it cleared up, and then it was clear sailing the whole way, and so it was cool. Um, and yesterday was fun. I had a show with Trisha Mason, who is someone this woman I've known for actually a really, really long time. I used to play in this band called the 220s quite a few years ago, but I was in the 220s for uh, quite a few years, and that band, like at one point became pretty much like a full time gig where I really couldn't do other projects. I ended up having to turn down for a few years. I couldn't really play with anyone else just because we were very busy. We were at one point we were like rehearsing 3 times a week, and then I was so busy with gigs with that band. We were playing all the time. Every weekend was usually booked up, and then other days. And at one point, we were starting to travel, and we were starting to go to other states, and at one point we got a lot of momentum with that band, and eventually things kind of shifted, and I ended up leaving the group. But during the time when the band was starting to really, I don't know, kind of gain an audience to a degree, we used to play up at this really cool bar that's long gone now up in Ellsworth called Chummies, and it was a local bar, but super cool place. It was like a big hot spot for music. All kinds of bands played there. It was a destination definitely to see music, but then all kinds of bands played there, and we used to play. We were in like a monthly kind of rotation there, and we ended up doing pretty well there. It was funny because that was one of the rare, it hasn't happened a lot, but that was one of the situations where I was in a band where at one point the band actually had a really big like fan base, and people would drive out of their way to come see us, and it was a localized thing, and we started to like really gain momentum. And Chummies was one of the places where that started to really happen, where after a few years of us kind of hitting the pavement, we started to kind of get an audience, and we started to get all this momentum, and it was a really great ride. It was a lot of work. We busted our butts as a band. For me personally, musically, it really pushed me because some of the music was very, very hard. One of the things that we did as a band that really kind of got us successful to a degree was we used to do these cover to cover shows, and cover to cover shows used to be in this venue called the Big Easy in Portland. That's now the Portland House of Music, but that used to be a, a spot where they would have bands come in and basically replicate a classic album. And we started doing those series, and we would do like Dark Side of the Moon, and we did like from Pink Floyd. We also did Echoes from Pink Floyd and Metal, and then we also did a Black Sabbath album. we did a few of those things, and it was a cool thing at one point because we would the way the sets would be divided. They would give us like 2 hours, and we would go in. And the band, the 220s, also was starting to go way into the original content world too. We were writing a lot of music, so we had a lot of original music too. So usually, what we would do is we would play an hour of all original tunes for a set, and then take like a short break, and then come back, and then play a cover album in its entirety. And during that time, people started to really get excited by that. It was a lot of work because we would try to replicate the albums from top to bottom, and that really started to, kind of connect with people. And when we used to play at Chummies, that's how I met Patricia Mason, and she's a local artist who she lives down in Rockland now. Super cool lady, very talented. A lot of cool things she's got going on, and we've stayed in touch for like the last 10 years or so. There was a time when we went in different directions. We lost touch, and then she kind of moved to the area. She used to live up in there in that area in Ellsworth, Bucksport, and then she moved to Rockland the last year or two, which is really close to me, and we kind of reconnected. And since then, we started playing some shows together with her band, and then a couple other kind of configurations. But we played last night at the Ellsworth Harbor Park, which is a super beautiful spot that I was really unaware of. I didn't really know it was there. It's a really nice like gazebo and space that they have where they do music on Fridays, and yeah, very cool. So we did that, but the weather was very nice. So, and then after that, I went to go to see a friend of mine who is just a really fabulous musician. He was playing a gig in Camden later that night, and I ended up going to that. I didn't think I was going to make it. I got pretty tired on the way back because it was like an hour drive, and it was kind of a long day. I was up there for a few hours, packed all my stuff up, and then came back. But then I kind of got my second wind, and then I wanted to go see music. I was kind of in a mood, and then ended up doing that, and that was a lot of fun. So, again, like I talked about in a video yesterday, that's when I can do it and a schedule permits, or I have the time to do it, or the night off, I'll go see music, and again, it's always inspiring to me. Even whatever whatever the music is. So it's very cool. So today's show is on a movie, and I'm going to talk about a little bit of a thing around which I've talked about here and there, but I want to get into books that have been adapted for film. But primarily, what I want to focus on today is American Psycho, um, starring Christian Bale. Such an awesome movie, and I honestly think one of the best film adaptations of a really great book. Of course, American Psycho, the book, was written by Bret Easton Ellis. He's written a lot of great books. He's also written screenplays for movies. I'm a big fan. He used to have, and I don't know if it's, I think the episodes are still available. But Bret Easton Ellis used to have a podcast where he would basically have different directors on his show, and it was such an awesome show. And one of the best ones he ever had was when he had Quentin Tarantino on there. One of the most insightful and interesting interviews I've ever come across. And so, again, American Psycho, I am a huge fan of the book written by Bret Easton Ellis. I had read the book quite a few years before the movie had come out. And I kind of feel like it's definitely one of the best adaptations of a classic book. It's it took all the right steps to translating a great story, and it also, in some ways, is very different to the original text, the original storyline, but it still really captures the essence of what makes that book so great and so and such an experience. There's throughout the years there obviously there's been tons and tons of movies that have been adapted from books that are really great, and a lot of the times a complaint by people is by the public is that it's not it's the translation is off. It's just not quite as good, or it is, to a degree, the story that was based on an original work is changed or hampered or watered down, and it's just not as it just doesn't have the same depth, or it's just not good. And I think of some of the books and some of the movies of where it's been really, really successful, because I think, obviously in the literary world, the when you're adapting a movie, and sometimes there's the occasion of where the original writer or the author of the book will be actually involved with the screenplay for the film. One of the biggest examples of that would be The Exorcist, William Peter Blatty. You know, Classic book, classic movie, arguably the scariest and the greatest horror movie of all time. Directed by, of course, William Friedkin, who just recently passed away. One of my favorite directors. I did a show, like a tribute show to him, and I did a show before that, maybe a few weeks before, on The Exorcist. But William Peter Blatty wrote the original book, and the book itself is really great. It's totally disturbing and kind of a horrific experience, but amazing. And he was directly involved with the film adaptation with William Friedkin. He actually wrote the screenplay, and it's different in a lot of ways, but I think in some ways it's almost more of a visceral experience when you see the movie. Of course, the story being around a young girl who is possessed by a demon, and it does go heavily into that and the whole subject matter. And supposedly Peter Blatty based it off some true stories that he believed to be true, which I don't believe to be true, but on some true life accounts. But he did a wonderful job with adapting the book to the big screen. One of the I was just watching a show the other day, and The Exorcist came out. The Exorcist has been a big topic lately because of the new Exorcist that's coming out, which I'm not very excited about. That's directed by David Allen Green, who also did the Halloween movies that recently came out the last few years. that were put out by Blumhouse, and Blumhouse is a big, probably the biggest and probably the most prolific studio out there right now that's putting out horror films. That's, some of their work is really, really great, amazing. Their biggest release and probably their best movie is Jordan Peele's Get Out. Like that's what put that company on the map. And it's an incredible movie. But I feel like a lot of the Blumhouse films are pretty hit or miss. Some of them are really kind of awful, and they seem to be all over the place. The other one that I really love is the Invisible Man remake. I think that movie is just tremendous. And there's been a few other films that are really, really great. I love what they do with the Purge films. They're responsible for those, and those are, I think that's arguably the best horror franchise right now. But then they do something like Firestarter, and just it's really generic movies that are really bland and, or if not terrible. And even the Halloween films were disappointing, although things aspects of those films are pretty good. And I have come, which is it puts me really in the minority, but I have come to really like the third one a lot, just because Halloween Kills, because they really tried to do something different. I think for the most part they were successful. A lot of similarities for me with Halloween 3, The Season of the Witch, which is one of my favorites in the entire franchise. But so since it's been announced and the trailer's been out, there's been a lot of talk of the new Exorcist that's coming out, and so a lot of people have been talking about William Friedkin, and the trailer was released and talking about the original movie, and it ironic and kind of strange timing, but he passed away during this kind of explosion of attention to the movie again. But and I also feel another great example of where I feel the adaptation of a great book to the screen is Children of Men, another amazing movie starring Clive Owen, one of the best kind of dystopian sci-fi movies I think ever done. A totally immersive, a super intense experience as a film. I I've seen that movie quite a few times. I did a review on that film. It wasn't until quite a few years later that I actually read the book, and the book is really, really great, really awesome. It's very, very different in a lot of ways, but it's still centered on the primary focus of Clive Owen's character being this character who is, to a degree, a savior, but he is protecting this woman who is facing death at any given moment, and the whole scenario is that women become sterile, and it's in this set in this dystopian future of where women, the human race is more or less about to face extinction because there are no more babies being born, and so there is like a limited time. But there is this one woman who gives birth to this baby, and she is being sought out after by all of these different parties who have all of these other interests. But an amazing film, and the book is just really great, and I think that that's a really, really great example of that. They're both very different experiences, but equally just awesome. And the other one that I think is really, really great is Dune, my favorite sci-fi book of all time, and that was recently redone, remade by Denis Villeneuve. Amazing, probably the best adaptation of Dune, which obviously has been tackled before. David Lynch, other spin-off movies. I'm a big fan of the David Lynch film, and there are some really good versions of that. With William Hurt, there's a movie that was created around the adaptation of Dune, which I think is really great. But I definitely think that Denis Villeneuve's, not only is he one of my favorite directors, but I think that it's definitely the greatest adaptation of that book. Uh, so there's a lot of great examples of that. Um, I think one of the ones that where the book I feel is super overrated, and the movie to me, for my money, blows away the actual book, is The Shining. The Shining is overall my favorite Stanley Kubrick movie. Stanley Kubrick is by far and away my favorite director of all time, and of course, it was adapted by Stephen King's novel, The Shining. I like Stephen King. I think some of his books are really great, but I generally share a very kind of unpopular opinion of his work. I kind of feel that there's a lot of times where he's a little bit overly hyped as a writer. And, The Shining itself is not a very good book. I have to be honest. I've read it a couple times. It's kind of silly. It's kind of there's a lot of fat in the movie, and I think with what Stanley Kubrick did, which is a pretty rare thing, is he basically cut all the fat out of the movie and got to the core story and made a much more made the film so much more superior to the book. And all the controversy around that, because Stanley Kubrick and Stephen King, especially Stephen King, really lambasted Kubrick's version of his work, and he's been notorious over the years for kind of trashing that movie. And then years later, he decided to remake The Shining into this, which was basically a television show, which was terrible, and it's exactly like the original novel, scene for scene, shot for shot. And to me, it's just another example of how of what a genius Kubrick was, to be able to, you know, transcend from the original work, but yet do something that totally outshines the original uh, base material. So so great. And I did a big show. I believe it was probably 4 or 5 months ago on The Shining. So really great. And but that being said, I do love some of Stephen King's work. My favorite book of his, which is one that I feel is super underrated, is The Eyes of a Dragon. And it's I believe it's probably the only book that he's done where he kind of took on the fantasy genre. It has a very, to a degree, a Tolkien aesthetic to it. It's all fantasy based. It's set in a mystical time around castles and knights and dragons, and it's pure fantasy, and there is horror elements, but really great, really really awesome. I've always thought that book should be adapted into a movie. Like, it would be a really great, sci-fi, not really sci-fi, but a really great fantasy, mystical kind of a story. And especially with the popularity, say, of like Dungeons and Dragons and the obvious, Lord of the Rings trilogy, the books, all of the films that have come out, it very much has that kind of larger than life world to it, and it's purely fantasy based, so it would be very cool. And also with the popularity of, say, Game of Thrones, so that kind of world building is very popular now. but the book has never been adapted to anything. And as far as I know, King hasn't done anything in that kind of genre before or since. I believe it's the only time he's ever ventured into the pure fantasy world, particularly around dragons and ancient kingdoms and things of that nature. But really awesome book. And then also another one that I really love. I think his another book of his that I just think is incredible, and also where I think the film is just so amazing, and it's something I really want to see again, is Pet Cemetery. I think that book is just incredible, and the movie adaptation, I think, is one of the most terrifying movies ever made. One of the scariest and creepiest horror movies ever made. I remember seeing that movie, and it just scared the shit out of me. And I read the book around that time too. Awesome. And then the other one that I really love of his is Salem's Lot. I think that is, another masterpiece. It's one of my favorite vampire movies and stories of all time. I love the original book. It's a classic story, and the film adaptation, directed by Toby Hooper from Texas Chainsaw Massacre, is just awesome too. So there are some, without a doubt, some, masterpieces that he has done throughout his career. Those are probably my favorites. Always hard to pick because he is so prolific, but those three stories, I would say, if I don't even think about it, that those just come to my mind, and so, great books, classic books that have been made into, classic, great movies. So that brings me to American Psycho, the which I read the book first before I saw the movie, and which was written by Bret Easton Ellis, who I think is one of the best worlds, one of the best figures in the literary world and also the filmmaking world. He's done lots of really great books, and he's also been involved with writing screenplays. Pretty controversial figure. He's known because a lot of his films and his stories, especially the original American Psycho, is such one of the most graphic, and to a degree, one of the most terrifying books ever written. It came out in '91, and I've read I've read it about two or three times, but it's such an intense journey. Um, he also wrote The Shards, which is something that just came out in 2021. Less Than Zero is another one that is a really great book and also was made into a movie. I think that stars Robert Downey Jr. Really great. Um, he also worked with Paul Schrader, who is one of my favorite directors. Of course, he was the writer for Taxi Driver, and he's worked, on numerous and has collaborated with Martin Scorsese over the years. He did this really great, another great book called The Rules of Attraction, and then also he wrote the this the screenplay for that for the film adaptation, The Rules of Attraction in 2002, and it's an awesome movie. It's pretty messed up. It's a pretty fucked up movie, but really great. Um, but I remember the when I first read American Psycho, it was my introduction to the work of Bret Easton Ellis, and I remember I read that book right. I think I read it right after I got out of college, and again, I've always been a fan of horror, of course, growing up, and it still remains to be my favorite genre. I've always had an interest to not like it's a weird thing, but like our culture, our culture is always it's always complicated, and we're things that become trendy or popular. But I've always been a fan or have been really interested in serial killers to a degree, not to the degree of where you have people out there that are you have fans of the genre and that are like myself who are fascinated by the psychology that's involved with people who are in a literal sense are monsters and they are predators and they are to a degree top of the food chain and what they're capable of doing without having any moral compass whatsoever or any belief or regard for societal restraints. And it's always been super interesting to me, the psychology around that and how, the idea of where you're have this character who is completely psychotic and does not conform to anything, to any rules or laws in that given society. So, I've always had a real interest in that. One of my favorite, probably my favorite film that deals with, say, true life or true crime, if you will, serial killers is Henry, the Portrait of a Serial Killer. The true story about Henry Lee Lucas, one of the most notorious serial killers of all time, one of the most frightening, if not the most frightening character in real life person of all time. And of course, you have Ed Gein, who was also a notorious true life serial killer who, basically the premise of Texas Chainsaw Massacre was modeled off of him. The creation of Leatherface, all of those things. Really, truly, truly disturbing, and you know, it's hard to comprehend that people like that actually exist. When we have fictional monsters, Dracula, Frankenstein, the Wolfman, but when we have real life monsters in the flesh that are, people like us walking around, it's always mind blowing. But the whole kind of true crime thing has shifted a lot to where it's become popular, but in a weird way where there are people who I know who take it to a degree of where I feel it's a little bit questionable. I I know somebody who, a friend who I play music with, one of his coworkers, he used to say, he had told me stories that he was really into the whole true crime thing, but took it to an extent of where he actually had posters of, in his actual apartment, had posters of Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker, one of the most, insane, true life serial killers ever, who, was just responsible for raping and killing people in L.A. in the '80s, and just one of the most frightening true life characters. And I know a woman, for instance, who has, you know, um, tattoo of the Unabomber on her shoulder. And I know of other people that actually have, gone to the extent of where they'll buy artwork that was created by John Wayne Gacy, another, monster, true life monster. So it's a weird slippery slope. There is a fascination. There was a documentary that came out on Netflix, which I haven't seen, but I've heard is really good, and it's about Richard Ramirez, who I just mentioned. And I guess one of the segments in that movie where they focus on the trial after he was caught, and they focus on there were these scenario the Kate the situation of where these girls would show up in support of him in solidarity, and they were essentially like groupies, and they were in love with him, and suddenly he was like this sexy figure and really disturbing. So there's been this odd, really dark, twisted kind of fascination of where I do feel it does kind of cross a line where how people view those things and then how they adapt them. It's one thing if you're a fan, say, of fictional monsters, like case in point, say Jason Voorhees from Friday the 13th, or even Leatherface, or Pinhead from Hellraiser. You buy their merchandise, and where you have T-shirts with their you know images on them, or even people get tattoos. But that's fictional based, and that's pure entertainment. Although Texas, like I said, is based off of somewhat of a true account with Ed Gein, but it's purely fictional. And or the Shape, Michael Myers, and that's one thing. I think that's healthy. But when you're cross that line and that's someone who actually is responsible for massacring and killing real people that have survived, figures like Jeffrey Dahmer, like true life monsters, it's questionable. That's just how I've always been. But I think American Psycho it's obviously centered on the story of Patrick Bateman, but it's pure fictional. It's a purely fictional based story, but it does deal with a serial killer. And the book itself, I remember reading it for the first time, and the book itself is it's easily the most graphic story I've ever read, and it goes into such graphic detail around the accounts of him basically killing and torturing these women. Patrick Bateman's character, and he's basically this high end young guy who works in New York City on Wall Street, who lives this jet set life, and he has completely no regard for women in any way, and he's a you know he lures them in and just slaughters them and looks at them as being little ants that he can just that he just steps on. And the movie and the story itself just does such a great job with. It's set in the 80s, but it has obviously all this great music and all these great references to the culture of that time. But it also deals with the dark underbelly of like the American dream, and also deals with looking at what the American culture is, and what greed can be, or what greed is perceived to be, and also to a degree equality. But the book itself is so horrendously graphic, but it's an amazing thing. I know people personally who don't like the book because of how graphic it is. And I think that, you know, if they were to adapt the book just like the novel, it would probably get an X rating because it's so incredibly graphic. And I think what they did when they adapted um, the book into a movie, they definitely did a wonderful job showing a little bit of restraint. Yet the graphic nature and the themes of the story are very, very explored. But when it comes to the graphic nature, it really has restraint and doesn't show you the brutality to the degree where the book takes you. And but it's such a great movie. I think it's one of the greatest uh, film adaptations of a book, and it's I think it's also one of the best roles that Christian Bale's ever done. That was the movie, and it's hard to believe it came out in 2000. That it's like 20, almost 24 years ago it came out. It was the first movie where you know, it made me realize who Christian Bale is. I think it really launched his career. Of course, he's become just a huge, huge megastar. Um, it was, and the film adaptation was directed by Mary Herron. She's also done Dollyard in 2022, actually, which is came out last year. Charlie Says, She also did a really great documentary about Betty Page, the famous, iconic kind of dominatrix figure in the 50s, notorious Betty Page. She also directed I Shot Andy Warhol, which is an awesome movie. The Moth Diaries, the Hannah Nicole story, which is pretty funny. I didn't realize that she directed that. But she's a pretty awesome director. And, she kind of came about as, now it's a little bit more of a thing of where you see it happening, which I think is great. But she was, she's a female director, and she kind of came onto the scene in the minority. There weren't many female directors, especially that were getting traction or notoriety and that were doing really great work. But she was, kind of ahead of her time with being a kind of a mover and shaker and being a woman who, had a great body of work. But American Psycho, I think, is definitely the best work she's ever done. An amazing cast, of course, Christian Bale, the amazing Jared Leto. William Defoe is so awesome in it. He plays Detective Donald. I think he's so incredible in this film. Chloe Sevigny is so great. Reese Witherspoon is also Reese Witherspoon is also in this film. Guinevere Turner, Justin Theroux. Such an awesome movie, and this was one of the films too that reintroduced me to like the '80s nostalgia. It's got all kinds of great references to the pop culture back then. Genesis, the band Genesis. It's got a lot of humor to it too. It's very, um, it's a satire. It's a black comedy. It's brutal as all hell, but it also has a lot of great focus on social commentary, but it's never heavy handed. It's never preachy, and it's also just such an entertaining movie. And I definitely consider it to be a horror movie because of the nature of it. But such an awesome movie. I only have this on DVD. It would be awesome to buy this on Blu-ray. I just haven't gotten around to it. This DVD is actually really good. It has lots of special features on here. Very interesting. There's a couple of documentaries on the making of the film. There's interviews with Bret Easton Ellis. Um, Very, very cool. But definitely the movie that, for me, put Christian Bale on the map. And I think this made him into the rock star that he eventually became. So, and it's hard to believe that it came out in 2000. And I definitely recommend people out there, if you're a fan of this book or story, definitely read the book. I know I've recommended the book to a few people over the years, and they couldn't get through it all because of the graphic nature. It is overall, I think the movie's a little bit better than the book, just because I think I have no problem with reading incredibly disturbing or watching incredibly disturbing movies or seeing incredibly disturbing things. I have a high threshold for that. But at the end of the day, it's got to be around. It's got to be centered on great characters and a good story, and it has to have good atmosphere for me. But I also, that being said, I'm also a fan of less is more. A lot of the times, what you don't see is even more frightening. And to have, as a filmmaker or a storyteller, to have a little bit of restraint can go a long way. It actually gives you more, I feel. And I think the film adaptation is that. I'm glad that they didn't go down that path where they fully, even though it is a very graphic movie and it's, completely insane, it doesn't go down that path that Bret Easton Ellis took. Because I don't think it would have worked if they did that. If they took that route for the big screen adaptation. Probably still would have been good, but I think it was a really great, just a really smart choice for what they decided to do with the film adaptation. So, but I definitely recommend the book. So this is Jason Dean, and please enjoy the weekend, and we will see you next time. Peace.